retribution on the mayor of Fort Lee for refusing to endorse him some months earlier, his reelection. Well, the more people I talked to in Trenton, Democrats and Republicans would just say, this doesn't quite add up. The endorsement of a part-time mayor 4 or 5 months before just wasn't that big of a deal, for a governor who was cruising to a landslide reelection, that, his lieutenants would have wanted to do something this drastic. So even before the mayor of Hoboken came forward, there was a lot of just kind of mystification about what had really happened in Fort Lee.
And as some of our listeners know, Steve Kornacki from Salon and MSNBC has a theory that the Fort Lee George Washington Bridge lane closures were actually related to a development project that is taking place right there. And that's, I think, a little more complicated than the Hoboken one where he just wanted something to go forward. This was going forward.
And there is still no motive there.
Right.
I talked to people on the city council and people are dealing with that Fort Lee development project. And, they pointed out that there had been many, many hearings, planning hearings, zoning hearings before this, and that, that neither the Port Authority nor the governor's office had really shown much interest in it. I mean, they hadn't testified. They hadn't weighed in on one side or the other.
Karen Tumulty, the famed, legendary national political correspondent for the Washington Post, interviewing members of the Fort Lee City Council. This is what it's come to.
At least the ones who were willing to talk to me.
So I want to move on, but listeners, on tomorrow's show, we will take a close look at the Hoboken Development Project that Mayor Zimmer is talking about, how it's linked to Christie's Port Authority appointee David Sampson, and why Mayor Zimmer did not give it the green light even after the alleged threat. We will also look into some more of her history of saying positive things about Governor Christie, including at a WNYC event. We'll play that clip, so that'll be on tomorrow's show. But Karen, some of the press is framing this moment as which is worse, Bridgegate or Benghazi. And there is simultaneously a new Senate report on the Benghazi attack that is critical of the State Department, of course, when Hillary Clinton was in charge. Does it criticize her by name for not providing better security?
Her name comes up only one time in this lengthy report, and that is in the Republican commentary at the end of it, just saying, in one sentence, that the ultimate responsibility for this lies with the Secretary of State because she's in charge of the government department. But the report overall is quite scathing about the State Department's performance throughout all of this. What it does not do, and in fact what it denies happened, is another one of the Republican talking points, this report comes out and says there was no conspiracy, however, to cover this up. This was just a complete failure in performance on the part of the State Department, but that there was not the conspiracy to cover it up that we've heard so much about.
Does it harm Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, in your opinion, or dare I ask it, which is worse, politically speaking, Bridgegate or Benghazi? And I really hate that framing, even though a lot of the press is doing it, because, which is worse, Benghazi. I'm sorry, 4 people died. But that doesn't mean it's a worse scandal for Clinton, like it's more on her on her hands than the Christie stuff is on his. So we have to be able to pick apart the politics from the seriousness of the incident.
We also don't know what the bridge scandal is yet. The bridge scandal may turn out to be nothing. So I think it could turn out to be something serious. It could, so I think that right now you can't sort of ask these two things. I think, people will argue when Hillary Clinton runs that, this was a black mark on her tenure as Secretary of State. It will come up. But the question is how people measure this against the rest of her record. And there's also a front page story on the Washington Post today about the effort on the part of former Secretary Clinton's allies now and herself in her upcoming memoir to sort of paint her tenure at the State Department in her own terms. So again, there are going to be a number of narratives out there, and a lot of things are going to happen between now and 2016. So for us to be sort of weighing an unfolding investigation that we are watching going on right now versus, the Benghazi thing, it's just not a comparison that you can really make.
And listeners, we have time for a few phone calls for Karen Tumty from the Washington Post on Hoboken or Bridgegate, on the Benghazi report, also on NSA. We'll spend a few minutes on that after the president's speech on Friday. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692, or post to WNYC.org. Click on Brian Lehrer Show. So, yeah, that race to define Hillary Clinton's tenure as Secretary of State, her memoir coming out, Republicans countering. I don't yet see any potential Democratic rivals countering. But we had former Defense Secretary Robert Gates on the show last week, and I asked him point blank, from a national security standpoint, do you think Hillary Clinton would make a good president? And he said,
well, let's just say that I have a lot of admiration for Hillary. It's expressed in the book. And with that, though, I would say that the Democrats probably don't need a Republican handicapping their race in 2016.
So, Karen Tumty, how much weight does that old Republican carry?
Well, again, I think the book will again be part of the argument. And Secretary Gates, there is one kind of damaging moment for Secretary Clinton in the book where she and the president are engaged in a conversation where she apparently says that her opposition to the surge in Iraq was politically motivated. But overall, he expresses quite a bit of admiration for her. The other thing, however, that he indicates in that book, apparently, is that she was on a pretty short leash at the State Department, that, the White House was really running things.
And that's kind of a revelation, isn't it? Because there was the sense, I thought, that Hillary Clinton had a lot of latitude on what to do at the State Department because she just, was so popular and had such a big power base.
But I think on some issues, she had a lot of running room. But I think on the things that were sort of deemed most central to national security, that stuff has always been run out of the White House.
Now, while we're on national security, how's the reaction to the president's NSA surveillance address, which we carried live on this show on Friday, shaping up in Congress? The civil libertarians I've been speaking with are, I would say, less than underwhelmed. In fact, I would say they consider it a fraud to claim that this changes anything from the civil liberties perspective.
And there's legislation that is going forward that is not going to stop. That would essentially end this collection of bulk data. There's a bill out there by Senator Leahy called the USA Freedom Act, and the president's announcement is not going to stop this from going forward. I think the real question from that speech is how they're going to implement some of the things that they're talking about. For instance, they say now that they want this collection of data to be done by the private sector. Well, the phone companies don't want to do this. So the question is, who is going to do this? And then there's also this question of how, we're not going to be so aggressive about spying on our allies in the future. Again, I think a lot of people are still kind of questioning what exactly does that mean.
And Brian Lehrer Show listeners should know this. Here's something you may want to see. Our producer, Jody Abergan, compiled the list of all the things we know the NSA can do so far, from Snowden documents, from press reports, and other sources, like it can set up a fake LinkedIn account, monitor upscale hotel reservations, install fake SIM cards to then control a cell phone, monitor some computers that aren't even connected to the internet, and many other things. To see the full list, go to WNYC.org and click on Brian Lehrer Show. Let's take a phone call, 212-433-WNYC. And Howard in the Bronx, you're on WNYC. Hello, Howard.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
Again. So I just wanted to say I was listening to your guest talk about Benghazi, And as I was telling the young woman I spoke to before, do you remember John Kerry and the Swift boat scandal? I think, in my opinion, the Republicans will use this against Hillary Clinton the way they used it against John Kerry. I think that once Hillary Clinton actually announces that she's running, they will turn this Benghazi business into a bell that will never stop ringing for her entire campaign. And there was an article in the New York Times a few days ago about Christie, and one of the things early in the article it says was that the Republican Party is desperate, they use the word desperate, to find somebody to take over the White House. And based on this, desperation, I think they will use this Benghazi business against her in a very nasty way. Whether or not it will hurt her actually remains to be seen, but that's my opinion.
Right. Well, it's part of a record. I don't know if it's exactly the same as Swift Boat. Karen, you remember that from 2004. Where there, he was a legitimate war hero on the front lines, and they got some people to say, oh, he really was, whatever they were saying about him in battle, and he was terrible to work for, and all of this stuff, and it was such a fabrication. Here, there is something that is a black mark on her record to some degree, but it's got to be put into the context of her entire record.
Whenever I think back to the Swift boat thing, though, I think of how that became such an object lesson for politicians in the future, because John Kerry saw these allegations come out in an ad buy, basically. It was an ad that was run against him, not a lot of money spent against it, and he decided not to respond to it because he thought that as a presidential candidate to stoop down to answering things like this that were false, would really kind of make him seem small. And he learned the hard way that in this media environment, in this internet and 24-hour news environment, you've got to swing back at everything. And that is also, by the way, I really do recommend people read the story on Hillary Clinton by my colleague Phil Rucker today. She is already, at least on her behalf, her allies are putting together a counterpunch operation on everything.
Mark in Wing, New Jersey. You're on WNYC. Hi, Mark.
Hi, guys. Good morning. Yes, great show, Brian, as normal. I wanted to say, if it were you or I who closed the bridge, I mean, we would be waterboarded with, like, black helicopters and taken to Guantanamo. I don't see why Christie doesn't own up to it and say, all right, look, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to prosecute. I'm going to find out who conducted this terrorist act. I mean, it's a national treasure, the George Washington Bridge, besides being, a bridge to the biggest city in our country, in the world. I mean, really, it's the center of everything. Instead, he's like circling the wagons, and he's saying, I don't know, that I fired that person. If you or I were involved and we said, no, we took care of that guy, we just fired him. I mean, it doesn't seem to be taking responsibility to get involved. Let's get down to the bottom of this. And he's just sort of like, I didn't do it, I don't know anything kind of thing. And it's a little upsetting for a governor.
Mark, thank you. Karen, I wonder if you parse the governor's statements or the governor's spokespeople's statement in the case of Hoboken, which I don't think he's commented on himself yet, as being very different. I think so far they're very different. So with respect to Bridgegate, he said very explicitly, I didn't know about this. And when I found out about it, I fired the people who were involved, or at least two of the people, I guess four of the people who were involved. And, somebody was talking to me last night about The West Wing, the old show The West Wing, and that there used to be some storylines on there. Remember this, when aides to the president would do something that was clearly on behalf of his policy agenda, but was a little dirty pool, and they'd say, the president can't know about this, so that his fingerprints would never be on it. That maybe something like that happened with respect to the bridge. But you can't say the same thing about Hoboken, which, if the charge is true, and we don't know if it's true, he ordered the lieutenant governor to threaten the mayor of Hoboken, unless they went forward on this development project. And so far, all they're doing is kind of attacking the messenger. Oh, MSNBC, the network that first she went on to make the charge, is biased against Christie, or things like that.
Yeah, again, we just don't know yet, but I do think that with 2 legislative investigations going on and the U.S. attorney looking into this, all of them with subpoena power, if in fact there is something to this, it is certain that it seems certain at least, that there is going to be an email trail or, something that is subpoenaable, if that is a word, that will get to the bottom of this. And also, witnesses can be subpoenaed and offered immunity to testify as to what really happened.
Nancy in Fort Lee, you're on WNYC, center of the storm. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Brian. I love your show, and I listen all the time. And I just wanted to say I live in Fort Lee now, and I'm from Hoboken. And to me, it all comes down to the abuse of power. Historically, in every age and every small to large area of government, people who feel that they're in power abuse it. And the day of Bridgegate, I was trying to cross the street in Fort Lee for physical therapy with a cane, by the way. I couldn't get across the street, and I looked to the right, and there were cars back as far as the eye could see, which impeded the school buses. So there has to be a reason for this to happen, and for people to be investigated. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And as far as Hoboken, I think that they thought that every Hoboken mayor had been corruptible. In my history of living there for 26 years, they all wound up arrested, practically every single one. And they thought she's just one more that can be either corrupted or intimidated. And I really have to admire